So Mr. Falk has worked for the United Nations, and he brought a report earlier this year where he stated that Israel is an apartheid state, which put also the discussion in another perspective. So I would like to, maybe you can say some words about it, why Israel is an apartheid state and why all this fuss about your report. So.
Well, I'll try to be very brief, so we have time for conversation, which I think will be more useful. Our report tries to say three things. First is that if you examine the system by which the Palestinian people are controlled by Israel, it satisfies the international law definition of apartheid, which is not tied to the South African precedent. It's a freestanding conception of a crime against humanity, and it's present in the 1973 International Convention on the crime of apartheid, and repeated in the Rome Statute that set up the International Criminal Court, which lists apartheid as one of several forms of crimes against humanity. So the first thing is that this is, I think, the first careful academic study of the allegation of apartheid that was sponsored by a UN agency, the UN Commission for Economic and Economic and Social Commission for West Asia, ESCWA in UN language. The second point I would make is that it is misleading, as the peace movement has done and as diplomacy has done, to speak about ending occupation as the key to peace between the Palestinians and Israelis. The essence of our argument is ending the occupation doesn't help the refugees, it doesn't help the Palestinian minority in Israel, and it doesn't help the Palestinian diaspora around the world, where Palestinians have been forced to live in exile with no right of return to their own homeland. So our argument essentially is that if you want peace between these two peoples, you have to first end apartheid as a structure of control. And in this regard, the South African precedent is relevant, because no one expected South Africa to accept the demand to end apartheid until the pressure that international community raised forced this unexpected change of attitude, which was signaled to the world by the release of Nelson Mandela from prison and the acceptance of the whole idea that a multiracial democracy was acceptable to the white elite that had imposed apartheid on the people. So, and the third point is that if you want that kind of outcome for Israel-Palestine, and you want sustainable peace, you have to do the same kind of thing. You have to create enough pressure so that Israel will change its approach, which it has no incentive to do at the present time. And the failure of both the diplomatic process, there's 20 plus years of the Oslo diplomacy, which helped Israel and hurt the Palestinians because it allowed the settlements to expand, the wall to be built, and a number of encroachments. So it wasn't neutral. The failure wasn't neutral. It contributed to the Zionist project, and it put the Palestinians in a more difficult situation than they had been before. So what I would say in concluding is that civil society has the responsibility and the opportunity to do what the UN has failed to do and to do what diplomacy has failed to do. And that if the Palestinians are to realize their inalienable right of self-determination, it depends on a mobilization of civil society and an increased pressure on Israel to change its policies and to recognize that its own interests depend on making a just peace, a peace in accordance with international law and the rights of the Palestinian people. Is that enough?
Is that clear? I don't know if you want to go straight to the questions of the public, or would you like Mr. Falk to explain a little bit about the BDS campaign, because this is also one of the parts that is in its conclusion, is you explicitly support the BDS campaign, so maybe you can explain a little bit about this, and then it's up to you.
Well, it follows from what I've been saying, that if you want peace, you have to increase the pressure on the Israeli government. And if you want to increase the pressure on the Israeli government, the best way to do it at the present time is through the BDS campaign. It's a non-violent, militant campaign that was very effective in changing the political climate in the context of South Africa. And there's every reason to believe, with the global solidarity movement increasing in its success, that a similar outcome can occur with respect to the Palestinian people. We should remember that history is on the side of the Palestinian struggle. It is the last great unfinished anti-colonial movement. And all of these movements, all of the anti-colonial movements, prevailed in the end despite being weaker militarily. Hard power has not controlled history in the last 75 years. And that's, in my view, the great unlearned lesson of those that are governing the world. They continue to believe that history is made by military superiority. And if you look back at who has won and who has lost in these major conflicts throughout this anti-colonial period, you will see it's always the weaker side that wins what I call the legitimacy war. And the Palestinians are winning the legitimacy war. And even the Israelis are indirectly acknowledging this by attacking their critics as anti-Semites or in ways that have no relation to the substantive reality. It's a sign of weakness on the Israeli part, on the Israeli side. And so my own sense is that even though the situation looks extremely difficult from a Palestinian perspective, history, the flow of history in the last 75 years is sufficiently encouraging to make us fight for what we believe in. I always tell my students, we're not smart enough to be pessimistic. because that implies a knowledge of the future. And so we have every responsibility to work for the future that we desire and that is in accordance with our values.